At 3 a.m., I heard her key turn in the door. My fiancée stopped dead when she saw me standing there. And then a man's voice from behind her said, "Babe, who's that?" I wasn't supposed to be home that night. My last meeting had been booked to run until midnight across town, but the client canceled at the last minute. I grabbed a late coffee, drove through empty streets, and pulled into my building's garage just before 3 in the morning. The whole place was silent, that eerie, muffled quiet you only get in the middle of the night. When I stepped into my apartment, I didn't turn on the main lights. Just the small lamp by the couch lit the living room. I figured I'd unwind for a few minutes before heading to bed. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. Then the metallic scrape of a key in the front door lock. I froze. There was only one other person with a key, my fiancée. She wasn't supposed to be back until morning. She told me she was staying at her friend Marcy's place after a girls' wine night. The door opened slowly. She stepped inside, one heel dangling from her hand, hair slightly tangled, makeup smudged at the corners. The moment her eyes landed on me sitting in the half-dark, her body went rigid. Before either of us could say anything, a man's voice drifted in from the hallway outside. "Babe, who's that?" It was casual. Too casual. Like he thought he was walking into a place, and I was just some random roommate. The man stepped inside behind her, and my stomach knotted instantly. He was older than me by a few years. Taller, well-built, with the smug ease of someone who believed they belonged there. His shirt was half untucked, the collar wrinkled, dark spots on the fabric where the night's humidity had clung. Mud streaked the sides of his expensive leather shoes. The smell of alcohol hit before he did. Not just beer, but that sharp scent of whiskey and layered over it. An aftershave I didn't recognize. They both stood there for a second, as if trying to process how to play this. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just looked from her to him, and back again, the silence pressing into the room like a weight. She recovered first, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. The words she muttered were some rushed attempt at an explanation. Her voice low, almost drowned out by the hum of the fridge. Something about a ride home, a friend of a friend. My eyes stayed on her, but I caught the man's reaction in the corner of my vision. A quick side glance toward her, then to me, sizing me up like he was debating whether to challenge my presence or back down. I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I leaned back into the couch, as if this entire situation bored me. It wasn't the reaction they expected. She shifted uncomfortably, clutching her purse to her side. He slipped his hands into his pockets, shoulders relaxing, but there was still that flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It was in that moment I decided I wasn't going to confront them the way they thought I would. No shouting, no accusations. They'd expect me to blow up. They'd expect me to demand answers. But if I stayed quiet, I could learn more. Maybe even find out how deep this went. I noticed something else. Hanging loosely from her other hand was her phone, the screen still lit. From where I sat, I could just make out the tail end of a message thread, but not enough to read clearly. When she noticed my glance, she tilted the phone slightly away, subtle but obvious enough for me to register that she didn't want me seeing it. The man finally muttered something about getting going. She nodded quickly, like she'd been waiting for that suggestion. He stepped back into the hallway without another word, and she followed, saying something over her shoulder about coming back soon to talk. The door clicked shut. I sat there for a full minute without moving. My pulse was steady, my breathing even, but my mind was racing through details like an investigator sifting through evidence at a crime scene. The wrinkled shirt, the muddy shoes, the smell of whiskey and aftershave, the way she froze when she saw me, the half-hidden phone screen. None of it added up to an innocent explanation. I walked to the door and peered through the peephole. They were still in the hallway, speaking in low voices. The man handed her something, looked like a folded slip of paper or maybe a receipt, and she tucked it into her purse. Then they walked toward the elevator, her body angled toward him in that too comfortable way people have when they're not just acquaintances. I knew enough to understand this wasn't just a one-off mistake. You don't bring someone like that to your apartment in the middle of the night unless you've already crossed the line long before. And you don't freeze in shock unless you're fully aware of how bad it looks. I sat back down and considered my options. My gut reaction was to confront her the moment she returned. But there were too many unknowns. Who was he really? How long had this been going on? Why was she so careless as to walk in here with him? And why did he act like he had nothing to fear? If I wanted the truth, I couldn't approach this like a jealous fiancé. I had to treat it like an investigation. That meant gathering evidence, piecing together a timeline, and letting them dig their own graves. So I stayed up. I watched the clock. And when she came back nearly an hour later, I acted half asleep, mumbling something about an early meeting before retreating to the bedroom. She seemed relieved not to have to explain anything. That was fine by me. By morning, I had already decided on the first step. I'd place a discreet camera near the front door and another down the hallway toward the bedroom. If she brought him back or anyone else, I'd have the footage. I'd also start checking the shared cloud account we used for photo storage. Most people forget it syncs location data automatically. As I left for work that morning, she was still asleep, curled on her side like nothing had happened. But when I glanced at her purse on the kitchen counter, I couldn't help but notice a folded slip of paper sticking out, just enough to see a string of numbers and what looked like the name of a luxury apartment complex across town. That was my next lead. I didn't go straight to the office. Instead, I drove past that luxury apartment complex printed on the slip of paper from her purse. The place was a new high-rise with private parking and a uniformed doorman. It wasn't somewhere you'd casually visit unless you knew someone inside. I didn't pull in. I circled the block twice, noting the layout. Side entrances, security cameras, blind spots. One particular alley behind the building looked like it led to a service entrance, the kind that might be less monitored. I logged it in my head. At work, I kept my normal routine outwardly, but by lunch I had the cameras ordered and on rush delivery. Compact, wireless, easy to hide. They'd blend in with the decor so well she'd never notice. That night, I told her I'd be swamped for the next few days with quarter-end reports. She nodded without much interest, already half absorbed in her phone. When I left the apartment later, I parked 2 blocks away and doubled back on foot. From the shadows across the street, I watched her leave about 20 minutes later. She wore the same leather jacket she'd had on the night before, the one she usually saved for nights out. She didn't want to explain in detail. She called a rideshare. I followed in my car, keeping distance. As expected, she went straight to the high-rise. The driver dropped her at the front, where the same tall man from the night before was waiting, leaning against the glass door, as if this was routine. I didn't approach. Not yet. I just let the confirmation settle in. Same man, same comfort level, same sense of ownership in his posture. When I got home, I installed the first camera in the hallway by the front door, angled toward both the entry and the bedroom. The second went in the living room, tucked into a decorative vase near the bookshelf. The app synced instantly, giving me a live feed on my phone. 2 nights later, the footage came through. She arrived just after midnight with him again. They moved like they owned the place. No caution, no hesitation. He dropped his coat on my chair, kicked off his shoes, and went straight to the fridge like he knew where everything was. She followed, laughing quietly at something he said. I replayed that clip 3 times, not because I needed more proof of the affair, that was obvious, but because of what happened next. While she disappeared into the bedroom, he drifted toward my desk. He picked up a folder, flipped through it, then pulled out his phone. He started taking photos. I leaned forward in my chair as I watched the video, every instinct telling me this wasn't about their relationship anymore. This was deliberate. Those papers weren't personal. They were drafts for an upcoming client proposal, something not yet public. If those details got out, it could cost my company the deal. The next day, I called an old friend, Scott, who worked in private security. I gave him a physical description, the high-rise address, and the few fragments I'd noticed. Expensive shoes, taste for whiskey worked with her somehow. By that evening, Scott had a name, Dean Carter, and a short file. Carter worked for a competitor in the same sector as me, their acquisitions department. That explained the interest in my documents. What it didn't explain was why my fiancée was involved. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces started clicking together. She had access to my home, my schedule, and by extension, to sensitive material I sometimes brought home. If she wanted to impress him, or worse, get something in return, handing over bits of my work would be an easy move. That week, I adjusted my strategy. I deliberately left certain documents on the desk, harmless but realistic looking, peppered with minor factual errors that could be traced if they appeared elsewhere. I even made them look urgent, scattering them across the desk as if I'd been mid-review before leaving in a rush. It didn't take long. On Friday night, she told me she was staying over at Marcy's again. 30 minutes after she left, the camera app buzzed with movement. There he was, alone this time, letting himself in with her key. He went straight to the desk, pulled out his phone, and started snapping photos of the bait documents. By Monday, those same confidential figures appeared in a competitor's proposal, the wrong figures, exactly as I'd planted them. I had him, and by extension, I had her. Now I needed it airtight. The next time she left, I followed her again. She went not to the high-rise this time, but to a small bar near the business district. He was already inside. They sat in a back booth, heads bent close. I stayed long enough to see him hand her a thick envelope, which she slipped into her bag without counting. I didn't need to see more. That night, I saved every video clip, every screenshot of the synced location data from her phone, every record from my planted documents showing up in competitor hands. I also pulled my building security footage from the nights they'd both entered together, a request the manager granted without question after I mentioned unauthorized access. The case was building faster than I expected, but I wasn't ready to tip my hand yet. If this was going to hit as hard as I wanted, it had to happen in a setting where they couldn't just walk away, where the fallout would be immediate and irreversible. In the meantime, I kept up the act. I smiled at breakfast. I asked about her girls' nights. I pretended to be too busy to join, and every time she left with that casual confidence, I knew it meant one more nail in her own coffin. But the whole time, one question kept circling my mind. Was this her idea from the start, or had he pulled her into it? The way she acted around him, the way she deferred to his lead in the videos, suggested it was mutual. And if it was mutual, then she wasn't just cheating, she was actively helping someone steal from me. That meant when the trap snapped shut, she'd be standing right next to him, and I'd make sure neither of them could wriggle free. The first problem with catching someone in a setup like this is timing. You can have all the evidence in the world, but if you spring it too early, you give them room to maneuver. Lawyers, lies, sympathy plays. They find a way to make it murky. I didn't want murky. I wanted undeniable. By now, the competitor's misuse of my confidential bait documents had caught the attention of my company's legal department. I'd, accidentally, let a senior partner overhear a comment about unusual leaks. Within hours, a quiet internal probe began. They didn't know yet that I was sitting on the smoking gun. 2 days later, I requested a meeting with our general counsel and head of security. I came armed with my compiled file, video clips from my hidden cameras, timestamps from our shared cloud location data, building security logs, and side-by-side comparisons of the false figures from my desk and the competitor's proposal. It was enough to make both men lean back in their chairs, eyes hardening. They asked me one question. Was I willing to let them act on it officially? I told them yes, but on one condition. I wanted to be there when the hammer came down. The plan formed quickly. Our legal team arranged a meeting with the competitor under the guise of clearing up intellectual property concerns. We booked a private dining room at one of the city's most upscale restaurants. My fiancée didn't know I had anything to do with it. To her, I would simply be out for the evening. 2 days before the meeting, I set the bait for her. Over dinner, I casually mentioned I'd be having a client celebration there. I dropped the name of the restaurant, watching her face for any sign of recognition. She didn't flinch. That meant one of two things. Either she was overconfident, or she didn't realize how close the walls were closing in. On the night of the confrontation, I arrived at the restaurant early with our legal team. The competitor's representatives arrived shortly after, including Dean Carter, perfectly groomed, his expression polite but cautious. He didn't see me right away. I was seated off to the side while introductions were made. Then the door to the private room opened again. And there she was. She hadn't come with him. She entered separately, wearing a fitted black dress I'd seen her save for special occasions. Her eyes skimmed the table, then landed on me. For a heartbeat, the air seemed to drain from the room. I didn't smile. I didn't speak. I just gestured to the empty chair beside me. She didn't sit. Instead, she glanced at Dean, and in that instant, the unspoken connection between them was obvious to everyone in the room. Our head of legal opened the meeting with polite formality, thanking the competitors' team for coming. Then, without any warm-up, he slid a folder across the table toward their lead attorney. Inside were printouts of my bait documents, side by side with the ones in the competitor's proposal, identical except for the deliberate errors I'd planted. The competitor's attorney frowned, flipping through the pages. Dean kept his eyes on the table, jaw tightening. My fiancée shifted uncomfortably, her hands clasped in her lap. Our legal counsel continued, calmly outlining the chain of custody for the documents, from my desk to the competitor's proposal, backed by security footage of Dean in my apartment, my fiancée letting him in, and him photographing the papers. The mood in the room shifted sharply. The competitor's attorney's voice turned cold as he asked Dean if he had anything to say. Dean tried to deflect, claimed he'd been given the documents by a source, and didn't know they were stolen. That's when our counsel slid a second folder across the table. This one contained printouts of text messages, screenshots from Dean's own phone, provided by a whistleblower in his office. The messages detailed exactly how my fiancé had passed him the information, along with the dates and payments he'd given her in return. Her breath caught audibly when she saw them. Dean's head snapped toward her, and for the first time, his composure cracked. He muttered something sharp, the kind of thing you only say when you realize your co-conspirator is about to become your scapegoat. The competitor's lead attorney closed the folder slowly, then turned to Dean with a look that made it clear his career was over. Without another word, he stood and left the room, leaving Dean and my fiancée sitting there like exposed criminals. But I wasn't finished. I leaned forward, finally breaking my silence. My voice was low, but every word was deliberate. I told Dean that the documents he'd stolen had been deliberately seeded with false information, and that using them had already backfired in the client's review process. I told my fiancée that I knew exactly where every payment had gone, down to the account she tried to hide in her maiden name. She started to speak, but I cut her off. I told her she had one choice: cooperate fully with the investigation, sign a written confession for our legal department, and return every cent she'd taken, or face both civil and criminal charges alongside Dean. She looked at Dean for support. He just stared at her with open contempt. It was clear he'd already decided to save himself. When she realized no one in the room was on her side, the fight went out of her. She signed. The room stayed silent except for the scratch of the pen. By the time we left the restaurant, she wasn't walking beside me anymore. She stayed 10 paces behind, head down, clutching her purse like it might shield her from the collapse of her life. I didn't take her home. I didn't even speak to her in the car. I dropped her outside her sister's apartment and drove away without looking back. That night, I forwarded copies of the signed confession, the security footage, and the payment records to my company's legal department. By morning, formal action was already underway. Dean was suspended pending termination. My fiancée was barred from the premises of my company and served notice of legal proceedings for breach of confidentiality. But that was just the professional fallout. The personal one was about to be far worse for her. The next day, I met privately with her father. I handed him the same file I'd given my legal team, minus the most sensitive corporate details. I explained exactly what she'd done, how she'd compromised me, and how she'd pocketed payments from another man in exchange for betraying my trust. His face went pale, then cold. He said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was clipped and final. She would receive no further financial support from him. The boutique business he'd been funding for her would close within the month. By the end of the week, her entire safety net was gone. Dean had cut her off. Her father had closed her accounts, and the legal case against her was moving forward. I wasn't celebrating. Not yet. There was one more thing I wanted before I considered it over. Something that would make sure she never forgot how she'd thrown everything away for a man who didn't care enough to stand by her. That opportunity came faster than I expected. 3 nights later, my building's doorman called to tell me she was in the lobby asking to come up. I told him to let her in. When she stepped off the elevator, she looked nothing like the woman who had once strutted into restaurants in designer heels. Her hair was unkempt, her makeup smudged, her clothes rumpled like she'd been living out of a suitcase. She asked me for just a chance to explain. I told her she'd had her chance at the restaurant. Then I handed her an envelope. Inside was a copy of the signed confession, a list of the restitution payments she owed, and the official notice of the lawsuit. I told her I'd make sure every potential employer she approached knew about her history. She called me cruel. I reminded her I was just being thorough. When she left, she didn't look back. And for the first time since that night at 3 a.m., I felt the weight begin to lift. Once she walked out of my apartment for the last time, I assumed I'd only see her again in legal contexts. But the universe, in its own quiet way, has a habit of making people cross paths when it wants to underline a point. The civil suit moved quickly. Between the signed confession, the payment trail, and the footage, she had no real defense. The only thing her lawyer managed was negotiating a payment plan for the damages rather than an immediate lump sum. That payment plan was still crushing. Her share of the damages, combined with the loss of her father's financial support, meant she was operating at a deficit before she'd even paid her own rent. Dean didn't fare any better. My company's complaint against the competitor was settled under strict terms. Dean's employment was terminated, and his professional reputation was publicly shredded in industry circles. He tried to downplay the corporate espionage charge when networking for new jobs, but the details had spread too far. No one in our field wanted to touch him. As for her, the social fallout was swift and merciless. Word traveled fast through her circle. Friends who had once clung to her at brunch stopped answering her calls. The boutique brand she'd flaunted on social media vanished. Her father quietly dissolved it after cutting her off. The apartment she had been renting in the nicer part of town was gone within a month when she couldn't keep up with rent. I stayed out of sight through all of it. Not because I was hiding, but because there was nothing left for me to say. Every interaction we might have had was already answered by the paperwork, the videos, and the reality she had built for herself. Still, there was one loose thread. She had returned the key to my apartment through her lawyer, but I kept a digital log of every access since the day I changed the locks. A few weeks after the restaurant confrontation, that log pinged with an unauthorized attempt. Someone had tried her old keycard in the garage gate. The security footage confirmed it was her, sitting in the passenger seat of a friend's car, craning her neck toward my parking spot, as if hoping I'd be there. I didn't report it. I just saved the footage. Another piece of insurance. The Real closing act came not from me, but from the market itself. The competitor that Dean had been feeding with stolen information had already used my fake figures in a proposal to a major client. That client, realizing they'd been misled, not only rejected their bid, but also pulled 2 other contracts from them. The financial loss was severe enough that the competitor announced layoffs. Dean's name was tied to the failed proposal internally. My fiancé's name, thanks to discovery in the civil case, was tied to the handoff. Even without jail time, they were radioactive. 2 months after the lawsuit concluded, I was walking out of a client meeting downtown when I spotted her across the street. She was wearing a faded windbreaker, hair pulled into a messy knot, talking into her phone with an expression that was more desperation than confidence. She didn't see me. I stayed where I was, watching as she stepped into a small cafe, one of those places that hires anyone willing to work for minimum wage and a free meal per shift. I'd imagined this moment before, back when the betrayal was still fresh. I thought seeing her reduced to this would bring a wave of satisfaction, maybe even triumph. Instead, what I felt was quieter. Not pity, never that, but a sense of confirmation. She'd written her own ending. All I'd done was refuse to edit it for her. From then on, I stopped looking for updates. I didn't check her social media, didn't ask mutual acquaintances. If she was rebuilding her life, it was far from mine, and that was enough. Dean, on the other hand, didn't disappear entirely. His name popped up once in a trade newsletter, not for a new job, but for being caught trying to start his own consultancy using confidential materials from a previous employer. It didn't take long for that venture to collapse. By then, his reputation was so toxic that even his former allies kept their distance. Meanwhile, my own career didn't just survive the whole ordeal, it quietly benefited from it. My role in catching the leak, paired with the airtight evidence I'd gathered, became something of a behind-the-scenes legend in my department. Senior management, without ever saying it outright, made it clear they trusted me with higher-level projects. But the biggest personal change wasn't professional, it was in how I approached trust. I didn't become paranoid, I didn't need to, but I became deliberate. I paid attention to patterns, to small inconsistencies, to the way people handled pressure. I stopped giving people the benefit of the doubt without reason. The last contact I had with her came through an email forwarded by my lawyer. It was a formal notice that she had completed her final restitution payment. The amount had been chipped away month by month, a reminder in my bank account of just how far she'd fallen from the woman who once thought she could juggle a fiancé and a corporate spy without consequences. The email ended with a short personal note from her lawyer, not from her directly, saying she hoped this would be the end of the matter. It already was. I didn't reply. Months later, I ran into her father again at an industry event. He was cordial, even friendly, though there was a reserve in his tone that hadn't been there before. At one point, over coffee, he said something that stuck with me. She told me once she thought she could handle two worlds at once. She learned too late they weren't hers to handle. That was all we said on the subject. We moved on to business talk, the way two people do when they've both decided a chapter is closed. The truth was, the real revenge wasn't in the lawsuit, or in the confrontation at the restaurant, or even in watching her lose everything. It was in knowing that for the rest of her life, she would have to live with the fact that her downfall wasn't a twist of bad luck. It was the direct, predictable result of her own decisions. And as for me, I walked out of the whole mess with my career intact, my reputation stronger, and my sense of control unshaken. She had tried to play two games at once and lost them both. I played one and I'd won. When I think back to that night at 3 a.m., when the key turned in the door and she froze in the doorway, I realized that was the moment the ending was already written. The man behind her saying, "Babe, who's that?" wasn't just a stranger intruding on my home. He was the proof I needed to see the truth about the person I was planning to marry. It didn't matter how carefully she tried to explain it away, or how much she thought she could manage the story. The second he stepped into that apartment, the clock started ticking, and I made sure I was the one who decided when it stopped. Now, when I walk into my apartment at night, the silence feels different. It's not empty, it's just mine. And that's worth more than any apology she could have offered. And that's the story.